At the end of this lecture, you should be able to answer this question. Can you invoke follow up intents directly without another intent preceding it? The first thing to understand here is what exactly is a follow up intent. Now, we've often had follow ups for different things in the real world. So, let's say you were to go to a burger joint and order your favorite burger, and you say, I want a burger and a shake. And then you might have the server follow up with, do you want fries with that? A follow up is a continuation of a conversation. A follow up question is usually such that it's terse. You might not really understand what exactly the question is about unless you're privy to the details of the original conversation. A follow up is an extension of what happened earlier, and it's assumed that you already know what happened earlier. Our earlier example, our car booking was a follow up to our room booking, but we essentially used a context to pass information between the room booking and the car booking. A better choice is to use a follow up intent. We saw the drawback in the previous case. Once we linked the two intents via a set date context, we could not invoke book cars directly. But if we use follow up intents, we can fix this problem. We can have book cars as a follow up to book rooms. We should also be able to book cars directly. Let's see how. Let's see what the current status of our intents are. We have the book cars as well as the book rooms. In the previous lecture, we had added an input context, the set date context, to the book cars intent. I would suggest you go ahead and delete the input context from the book cars intent. I'm not going to show you the steps here because you know what to do. This will allow the book cars intent to be invoked directly when the customer just types in book a car for me or book a sedan for me directly without having booked a room. Once we fix that, we'll see how to follow up a book rooms with a book cars by setting up a follow up intent. This is a brand new intent, and the parent intent is the book rooms. So simply click on add a follow up intent under book rooms. This will add a child intent under book rooms. There are different kinds of follow up intents. You can explore that by yourself. What we are interested in is a custom follow up intent. So make that choice. So you have a custom follow up intent which follows book rooms. The name of this intent here is book rooms dash custom. The objective of this intent is very straightforward. This allows us to reserve a car as a follow up to booking a hotel room. This intent will already have all the context associated with our previous room booking, and we will set it to pick up the date automatically from our previous intent. We'll configure this follow up intent to be exactly the same as the book cars intent with one crucial difference: the fact that it accepts an input context, which is the output context of the book rooms. This is what enables it to be a follow up intent. When you specify this as a follow up intent, the input context comes in pre configured. The input context is equal to the output context of the book rooms. So there are two input contexts here: the book rooms follow up and the set date. Both of these are output context for the book rooms intent. Dialogflow has actually saved you from a lot of manual configuration. Instead of you having to manually configure the output context of book rooms as an input context to the book cars intent, you can simply say add a follow up intent and the contexts are set up correctly, exactly the way you'd expect it to be. There is no additional intervention needed from our end in order to have the context flow into our new custom intent. We just need to set up the rest of the configuration. We can also refine the expressions that we would use to book a car here. We can say also a car, book me a sedan too, and so on. The phrases that a user might use to book a car when we invoke a follow up intent will be subtly different than when booking a car directly, because the follow up intent assumes that there is a lot of context available. We've already booked a room and so on. So make sure you incorporate that in the user expressions. Now, because the customer assumes that you know the date for which you want the car booking when we are in this follow up intent, none of the user expressions will specify the date, which means the date parameter has to be added in manually. Dialogflow has a provision for this as well. Now, first, let's mark the required parameters. The type of car is a required parameter, so we go ahead and check that checkbox. Once this is a required parameter, we also need to define the prompts to extract the car type that the user wants to reserve. The two parameters whose values we require from the user for our book car's intent is the car type as well as the date on which we want the booking. Now, because this is a follow up intent, we need to get the date information from the input context and not from user expressions, which is why none of the user expressions that we defined had the date parameter within it. The default value can be set up only once the date parameter is in the parameters table, which is why we manually add it in. We specify the parameter name as date. We specify an entity type of type at sys date, and we have the date parameter set up. There is one last thing that you need to specify, that is the placeholder or the variable name, so that we can reference this particular value in our text responses. We'll simply call it $date. Mark this as a required parameter because it is indeed required in order to actually book our car. And we can now specify a default value for this. The default value we want to be picked up from the input context that is passed in the set date context. Click on the three vertical dots, which is where we define the default value, and specify the default value to be hash set date dot date. Set date is the context and date is the placeholder or the variable which holds the date value from the previous book room's intent to which this intent is a follow up. You can now close this dialog. The only thing left to configure for this intent is the text response for a successful car booking. You can say, done, I've booked you a car type for this particular date, and click on save. You're now ready to test this follow up intent. We start off by invoking the book room's intent. Need a single room in LA for Tuesday. This has all the parameter values. This booking will be successful. The booking is for the 10th of October 2017. And notice that the context that has been set is the book room's follow up as well as the set date. And if you remember, these are the same contexts that are the input contexts for our follow up intent. Now that we've successfully booked a room, you can say add a hatchback to. This is the follow up to our book rooms. The intent that was invoked is the book room's custom intent, that is our follow up intent, and all the required parameters for this intent has its corresponding values. We have the car type and the date for which we want the booking. We get the date from the input context. The intent that was invoked is the book rooms dash custom intent, that is our follow up intent, and the parameters and the corresponding values are as you can see on this particular table. And this is how we can set up our bot to carry on long running dialogues with our customer. These are more natural, they are more helpful, and they'll help your user navigate your site or your app better. Using follow up intents are the right way to have a dialogue which spans multiple intents. The standalone intents you'll use for standalone actions. The answer to this question should be pretty obvious to you now. Can follow up intents be invoked directly? And the answer is no. Follow up intents have input context which it receives from the output of the intents that it is a follow up to. Without this input context set, the follow up intents cannot be invoked, which means they can't be triggered directly.